We decided to focus on working towards the motivation and engagement theme with the intent that this research would focus primarily on learners who had achieved a grade 2 in GCSE maths and who were working to improve this to a grade 3 this academic year. After involving our network partners, this became apparent that it would not be practical to maintain this particular variable. As a group, we felt that the title was rather broad, but that gave us scope to distill our action research down to a more focused project. For a long time, our question remained, what does an engaging maths lesson look like and how do we teach them? Our initial reading gave us the opportunity to explore how other researchers had tackled possibly the biggest hurdle of our question, what does engagement mean and how do we measure it? The literature that we examined showed that we had a tough decision to take. Do we define it for the learners or do we ask the learners to define it for us? Several papers were looked at and you can see those on screen now. These researchers gave us the impression that for our research to be effective, we should ensure that the learners have an opportunity to tell us what they considered to be engagement. However, it was also clear that we should not simply rely on their own judgment. To that end, we agreed that we would produce our own definition of engagement in order to share with the learners based on the responses we got from our initial surveys. We then concluded that the literature we had examined showed that we should then test how much a learner considered they engaged through a series of lessons that we designed in response to the initial survey. When we came to confirming our research question, we were asked to design an instrument which would be used to gather information from our subjects. As part of this, we paid particularly close attention to Kong et al. And Kuchen et al.'s research. Both teams had developed an instrument for measuring engagement. However, it was generally acknowledged that we lacked the resources in order to produce the results on a similar scale to these studies. We therefore elected to adapt elements of both research projects for our own study. And then prior to conducting our research, we referred to McNiff's ethical advice on including participants in our study. So in our initial survey, we asked learners to provide information in order to inform us of learners' highest GCSE maths grade, if they attributed and made a correlation between engagement and learning, if they attributed and made a correlation between engagement and enjoyment. We then asked the learners to rank 10 different activities that a practitioner might employ whilst delivering in the classroom in order to show which of these activities they found most and least engaging. Following that, we asked the respondents to indicate their opinions of 9 statements. These were adapted from Kong et al.'s research paper, where they asked their learners to respond to 57 different questions, which covered cognitive engagement, affective engagement, and behavioural engagement. We felt we couldn't ask our learners to answer questions in such detail. However, from each of the categories, a question was selected from subcategories, which we felt were most appropriate. In order to make our results purposeful, we rephrased them as appropriate. At this point, we asked the respondents to reply to only closed questions so we could work with quantitative data. Following the survey, we then went on to examine the results and used these to plan lessons to deliver our learners. Those lessons were planned to include elements that the respondents had told us they found engaging. We met with our network partners to update them, and it was suggested at that meeting that we might want to include a session that include the opposite of what our learners told us they found engaging. At this point, we discussed that our learners would not necessarily be learners who were all working towards a grade 3, but some to a grade 4, due to the enrolment process for learners at our partner colleges. Similarly, we discussed how we could best plan for these learners, considering that we were following 3 different schemes of work. It was therefore decided we'd plan standalone revision sessions focused on number, algebra, geometry, and statistics that could be dropped into 3 different schemes of work. We talked that it would be beneficial to ask each learner about their engagement during that lesson, rather than asking learners to reflect at the end of all 4 sessions. We therefore devised exit tickets to ask the learners to complete at the end of each session to briefly inform us of how the lesson had felt for each learner. In addition to this, we suggested that the member of staff delivering the session might keep a Bales analysis of the session where appropriate, in order to show where they had seen evidence of learners being engaged in the lesson. At the end of the 4-lesson programme, we planned to survey the learners in a similar quantitative style to the first questionnaire, and to then complement this with additional interviews from both learners and teachers in order to collect some qualitative data that we would be able to use to help us form some conclusions. At this point, we took a step back from our research to consider the question that we were posing and decided to refine it slightly so that it became, what does an engaging math revision lesson look like from the student's perspective, and how do teachers plan in response to this? Regrettably, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, only one of our researchers was able to deliver a revision session, at which point our research had to stop. So our results from our first survey showed that 57% of our 148 learners had a grade 3 in maths, 32% had a grade 2, and 11% had a grade D, E, 1 or U. 92% of our learners agreed or strongly agreed that they thought an engaging lesson meant they were learning. Similarly, 84% agreed or strongly agreed that they thought that if they were engaged in the lesson, that meant they were enjoying it. When we asked the learners to rank the statements regarding the engagement activities, they responded saying that using technology was their most popular opinion, and then listening to the teacher, working in groups, the learning being linked to the real world, the learning being exam focused, doing hands-on activities, we discover things on our own, taking the learners out of the constraints of the classroom environment, moving around the classroom, and the learning being linked to the learner's main programme being the least engaging. We were surprised by some of the results that we collected for this task. Some of the tasks that we considered to be poor for knowledge retention, i.e. listening to the teacher, were considered to be more engaging by the learners than other activities, such as the learners being allowed to discover things on their own. The 9 statements that we asked the learners to agree or disagree to were: learning formulas is the best way to learn maths. When I learn maths, I wonder how much this applies to real life. The best way to learn maths is to follow the teacher's instructions. I enjoy learning new things in maths. I'm happy when I work hard and successfully finish tasks. I'm always worried about my maths results. I do not like attending maths classes. I put a lot of effort into maths lessons. If I cannot solve a problem, I try a different method. When we analysed the data with respect to these statements, all of these were agreed with unanimously. Finally, 53% of our learners admitted to not spending any time devoted to maths work outside of a maths lesson each week. 26% said they spent up to half an hour, and 16% they spent between 30 and 60 minutes each week on maths. The reason for including this question was twofold. Firstly, because it would give us an indication of how much a learner might engage in a lesson, the theory being that learners who engaged outside of the lesson were more likely to engage inside the lesson. Secondly, it was a way for us to validate our results. As professionals, we were acutely aware that very few of our learners spent time working on maths outside of the classroom. As a result, we felt that if the results of this question matched our assumption, we would be able to have some increased confidence in the other responses that the learners had given. So 42 students participated in this particular lesson, that was the only one that was able to be delivered. An analysis of the data collected demonstrates students were engaged and progressed during this lesson. The number revision lesson was planned by applying the 4 methods of learning identified as preferred methods from students' perspective, which are technology, listening to the teacher, working in pairs or groups, and linked to the real world. And this session was structured around AQA's 5 R's approach. Slide 1 shows the knowledge quiz starter activity in the ready section of the lesson. Students worked in pairs or worked in groups, and the teacher asked 12 questions in rapid succession. Students solved questions and wrote down their answers. When the teacher had finished asking questions, students were selected to provide their answer. And if they didn't know, answering each question was opened up to the classroom. At the point when an answer is provided, an opportunity is offered to the teacher to expand further on this particular topic or question. The same process is repeated until all the questions were answers, and students add up their correct answers to reveal their score out of 12. The idea was to drive rapid recall of a student's knowledge, not all 12 questions, focused on number topics. The knowledge quiz is an opportunity to include elements of other maths topics in a revision lesson. The link to the real world slide in the revised section gave students the opportunity to work in pairs and link number topics to the real world. Students were provided with a template and given 5 minutes to discuss this and write answers on their sheet. The number slide 2 was planned as a reveal slide for number topics. However, this proved to create the opportunity for students to listen to the teacher and discuss all number topics in greater detail, revealing more in-depth real-world links. Slide 2 on the right-hand side shows how exam questions are included in the ready part of the lesson, as it is critical for students to be able to apply skills learned in the classroom to exam questions. Students were asked to work in pairs. At the end of the lesson, the 42 learners were asked to respond in the following questions. Using a scale from 1 to 5, how would you measure your progress in learning in this lesson today? To which 71 were extremely positive. And then using a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your engagement in class? To which 67 were positive. 86% of learners found the starter activity engaging, and 90% considered the main activity engaging. Finally, 93 found the plenary and exit activity to be engaging. So these slides here show some examples of the styles of learning that the learners identified as not being engaging. We felt that testing these learning styles would further help us to validate our research data. If learners said that they didn't enjoy this session or that they weren't engaged with it, then we could potentially infer that our initial survey had more relevance to the research question than we were posing. The way the lesson addressed the 4 lowest ranking learning styles were as follows. We discovered things on our own. So delivery was to focus on very open questioning or group work to identify the pros and cons of different types of graphs and charts. We looked at the going outside category, so we're going to take some learners into a car park to survey something of relevance. The we move around the classroom category was represented by the treasure hunt activity shown on the right hand side. And finally, the linking to vocational areas category was represented by a discussion around group work activities like the one being shown to the left. Obviously, we prefer to conclude our research having been able to deliver all of the lessons and collecting additional feedback, etc. But due to lockdown, this wasn't possible. However, we have drawn the following conclusions given what we were able to do. We were surprised that a lot of learners who we surveyed had a perception that an engaging learning style was not what we expected. For example, we were shocked that learners considered listening to the teacher to be engaging. Our research was valid and relevant to the learners in the room, as shown through their honesty that we entrusted to them. It has shown that this was a relevant exercise to do with the learners, and we've learnt a lot about our learners. This research has given us something to investigate and provided us with a lesson learned, which is, should we be asking these questions with all of our groups? If we are to value anything that has come from this experience, perhaps it is the opportunity to have tailored something purposeful for a group of learners. Involving the learners in their own learning, allowing them to influence their own learning and giving learners the opportunity to have this input meant that they were felt that their answers would be valued. And had we been able to fully deploy our lessons as we had planned to, we believe that our learners would have seen value in what they had taken part in, even if their responses to the final survey were not full of admiration for their experience of the project. And finally, as we have already said, it's been a useful opportunity for us to be involved with. As a result, we're in the midst of discussion surrounding whether we restart the investigation in order to improve our own curricula in the future, either as part of the CfEM or independently. So to sum up, whilst our research might be incomplete as it stands, we believe that we have shown that involving a learner in the learning process has as much value as the learning that happens on a day-to-day basis. Several years ago, academics held VARC questionnaires with some relevance, and yet present thinking suggests that they do not necessarily hold much pedagogical weight. However, maybe their significance isn't in the information that they reveal, but in the act of showing care for a learner. Thanks for your listening, and would like to invite some questions.